Hello, and welcome to our week on disciplining citizens. We're looking at state institutions in the middle of the 19th century. This is a period of tremendous expansion of the role of the state in Canadian society. And in particular, we're going to look at some examples here of schools, prisons, and asylums. And these are large institutions, both physically, prisons and asylums in particular, big buildings. And schools aren't as big in terms of buildings. Certainly most schools in this time period are smaller than modern schools, that's for sure. But they're all over the province. There's many, many of them, all over the country for that matter. But the key thing is that they're really expensive. They take up an increasing amount of the budgets of the colonial governments in this time period, which means that they have to raise taxes, they have to raise revenue, they have to find ways to build the economy, as we would say today. And this is putting greater pressures on society and on politics, and people are grappling with this issue of what this means to have these new expensive institutions and how to run them and how to run them well and how much to fund them and so on. This painting is a lovely example of that. This is Robert Harris, the meeting of the school trustees. It's from the 1880s, a little later than our course, but certainly gets at an emerging theme in education in the 19th century, which is the increased role of women in education. And that's very much related to this expanding place of education. This is a traditionalist society that's not had mass education before, never mind women involved in public roles, but they're unsure of it. And this, you can see the kind of tentativeness of these men. These men are looking slightly humbled, slightly subordinate to this woman, this strong young woman, in a society that hasn't placed an awful lot of value or leadership roles for women at this time. This woman looks strong. This woman looks important. Nice glow around her head, giving herself a kind of importance in this picture that many women at this time wouldn't have had. So that certainly reflects kind of the tension in the society, change, but also a new role for women that's quite interesting and quite significant. We're going to look at a couple things here in this video. We're going to look at the basic issue of establishing education as a state function, and we'll see what we're talking about there in a moment. Have a little quick run through the public versus sectarian or religious schools, if you will. In other words, who's going to run these? Or is the state going to run these, or are the churches going to run these? Then we'll look at methods of mass schooling, and then we're going to shift outwards to look at some other institutions. And there, I want to suggest some parallels in a number of fronts about these state institutions. I've already suggested money is one of them, and growth, and a relationship to the state, but they have some other ones as well, which I think are worth pursuing. Education so we're kind of looking at this period in the middle of the 19th century, 1840s, 50s, 60s. But certainly in an earlier period, say in that Loyalist period, 1790s, early 1800s, education effectively didn't exist. Certainly public education didn't really exist. Most education, as it existed, was private education. And this is where typically the children of the elite would be schooled, educated at the hands of some sort of notable figure in the town, in the colony, or whatever. These would have existed in lots of places around most colonies. Certainly both Nova Scotia and Upper Canada have a couple of small private schools operating early in the 19th century. But most figures in the elite would have sent their children to somebody else in the elite, so somebody high-ranking in the elite. And two figures here who stand out in this kind of story are Bishop Strachan in Upper Canada and Bishop Inglis in Nova Scotia, both of whom we've met these people before. They're major Anglican church figures, very much figures within the colonial elites, very much loyalists, and very much in that kind of conservative tradition that we've talked about in the past. These men did not educate lots of people. They would have taken in 1, 2, 3, 4 a year for a kind of private classical education. And typically what they'd be training is kind of a basic inculcation of classical text, classical reading skills, a little bit of math, a little bit of science, but really directed towards a kind of classical education, and ultimately usually oriented towards training for the bar so that they would become lawyers. And so again, it really is a tiny slice of the population that would benefit from this. Only the real elite of the colony would educate them, would benefit from this kind of education. And there really wasn't a whole lot more. And certainly there's an extensive series of discussions in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s about ways to expand that, about ways to bring that to more and more people. And I think we can link that, broadly speaking, into that kind of sense of democratization of society, that more people need education. Certainly there's an evangelical dimension here, because, of course, evangelicals have that kind of connection between reading the Bible and having a relationship with God. So if you can't read the Bible, you can't have that relationship with God. So certainly education is meant to be thought to be important, very, very, very important there. So there's a whole bunch of things going on here, kind of pushing people towards broader-based education. You see some steps taken in this direction. This is an interesting example in Halifax. There's comparable things in Toronto and Montreal. It's called the National School. It's a privately funded school, a little bit of state money going into it, but not much. And it's meant to help the poor, but not all of the poor. And they specifically target Indigenous people, but don't think big numbers here. We're thinking like 1 or 2 students a year would attend this school. Some African American students would attend this school, and again, small numbers, 3 or 4. And 5 or 6, poor working class kids, maybe orphans from the city, would get this kind of education. Again, we're talking pretty small numbers, but a kind of half charitable, half state-run, half church-run, private kind of institution, fairly small scale, and as much intended for charity purposes and kind of moral uplift of oppressed peoples, small numbers of them, as anything else. Certainly nothing like a public school system. The other debate you're going to see in this time period, not just about growth, but about who will run these schools. And a basic question is, will the state run these schools, or will the churches run the schools? Certainly the churches are interested in running schools. Certainly there are many Catholic schools. In Nova Scotia you see Presbyterian schools. In Upper Canada you can see Methodist schools. You certainly see kind of emerging examples of particular churches running schools, but again, not on a broad basis. I mean, so for example, the one in Nova Scotia is called Pictou Academy. It's run by the Presbyterian Church. It takes between 20 and 30 students a year. In Pictou County in the 1820s, there are probably 1,000 or 1,500 kids available to go to this school, but only about 20 or 25 of them are going to go there. So you're not talking, broad-based education here. It's expanding, and the churches are willing to do this, but that doesn't mean they're willing to pay for a kind of broad expanse to cover all of those kids. And that's where the state has a capacity to step in, that it has more money available to it, more capacity, and it's willing to kind of take on that, or is increasingly willing to take on that. Of course, that's going to require taxation, because you're going to need money to run this kind of system. That means that people have to accept the willingness to pay those taxes to pay for the schooling. That's getting a little ahead of ourselves right here. So the question here is state versus faith-based education systems. And you certainly see contests between majority Protestant populations in English Canada and majority Catholic populations in French Canada, and who would control those faith-based systems. So what you see emerging in Upper Canada, or Ontario as we would say today, is a dominant public system, a state-funded system, but with a large, though clearly subordinate, Catholic system. In other words, one's going to be a secular, state-run system, dominant system, but with a place for a Catholic minority position to exist within the colony. In Quebec, it's exactly the opposite. There you have a dominant Catholic system with a large but subordinate public system, which is where most Protestants would have sent their kids. So again, you see different practices in the country based on religion, based on ethnicity. And again, this is a kind of theme that keeps showing up in our course of different institutions being used by the state, by the churches, cultural institutions, to accommodate people's different interests, different expectations. Where you see real clear hold on sectarianism of religious education is in the universities. Most universities in the 19th century are started by churches. And here's we don't have to go through this entire list here, but you can see in Nova Scotia, Acadia University, King's College, St. Francis Xavier, Baptist, Anglican, Catholic churches, and the same pattern going on across the country. Queen's University as a Presbyterian school, King's College as an Anglican school, and so on. This is a pattern that emerges across the country. Couple of exceptions, both in the maritime colonies. One in Halifax, Dalhousie University, is a sectarian school. Sorry, not a sectarian school, it's a public school. And the University of New Brunswick is a public school as well. So again, no direct religious affiliations. It's not to say that churches weren't influential in the running them or anything of the sort, but they're not run by the churches. That's the distinction that we would have to make here. We're going to see an important role for a number of religious figures. We've seen this man before, Egerton Ryerson. He will be the superintendent of education in Upper Canada, Canada West, for almost 30 years in the 1840s to 1870. And probably nobody in Canada has a single more important influence than Egerton Ryerson. Methodist preacher, we met him a few weeks earlier at the Beaver Dams Church. He was a Methodist preacher, moves into the education field, but he gave his first sermon at Beaver Dams Church, and certainly comes out of that evangelical tradition and that kind of democratizing impulse that we saw within Methodism in general, but in evangelical churches in particular. And certainly interested in getting the tools of religiosity into the hands of many, many people. He certainly saw education as a form of offering possibilities of Christianization to people. And of getting proper faith amongst these people. He has other motivations as well, but certainly that's one of his primary ones, and certainly one that we've certainly pointed to this a number of times in the course as an interesting theme in the 19th century of how religiosity and evangelicalism is often driving part of the story. We could use any number of examples, but the Upper Canadian example is probably the best example. It has the earliest broad-based public education program, started in 1841, and it sets up a basic structure that will be used in most of the colonies, except for Quebec, and we'll talk about that later. But they'll set up a kind of system that consists of, at the local level, boards that are elected to represent communities on these local boards. Then you'll have an office of the superintendent of education. That person will send out inspectors to work in the different local boards to make sure that the schools are up to snuff, to make sure that the teachers are properly qualified, all those kinds of things. And then a central inspection office that also regulates that whole process, collects statistics, and ensures that the process is running smoothly. And really what they're interested in there is having a kind of efficient, bureaucratically administered, state-run school. Taxes are going to pay for this. Therefore, those taxes have to be accountable. You need to make sure that the schools are being funded properly, being maintained properly, children are being taught properly. Make sure that the children are actually attending schools. There's a lot of resistance in rural areas in particular, and your readings get at some of this, where farm families in particular are resistant to allowing their children to go off to school because those children are expected to be doing work around the farm. They're labor for the productive farm household. So there's a tension there. Certainly most farm households want education for their children, but they don't want their children taken away from them, the labor of the children taken away from the family. Now, a question emerges about why common schools. And here we're going to point to three things. And we've already pointed to the religious dimension of that, but that of course points to maybe religions running the school. But there was also thoughts from political, theoretical, academic circles that other considerations needed to be met. The first of these, and I think this is probably the most commonly known and perhaps the most important as well, is the political dimension of all of this. And that's that kind of basic notion that in a modern democracy, where you say that people have equal rights, where you say that people have an equal role to play in that society, that modern democracies demand educated citizens. They demand people who can read the laws, understand the laws, be informed about political debate, that education is critical to having a citizenry that can actively participate in a modern democracy. So that political dimension is very, very important. It means the schools provide not just training to individuals, but actually provide training that enables the society to function well and to function effectively. So that's a very, very important consideration for having common schools, rather than kind of disparate groups of different. Imagine if every religious group, for example, ran its own schools. You'd have different policies, different types of education, different things happening. This ensures that the broader country, the nation state, is guiding that process. There's also an economic dimension, which is particularly as an industrial economy emerges, but also amongst shopkeepers and people who will work for commercial operations, that a certain amount of literacy and numeracy is going to be expected. So whether you're a factory worker who just needs to be able to read a kind of basic numeric chart that says, what you're doing, take a measurement of something that you're doing, a meter reading of some sort, a basic level of numeracy is really going to be required for that kind of job. But also as kind of basic training for somebody who might become like an accountant or a scientist or something more advanced like that. But certainly from a basic level that you would need to have some kind of base to work with. And so common schools would be best at providing for that. And the third, and here we're kind of moving into a kind of more sociological direction, the kind of social dimension. A lot of concerns about immigration. We saw this 2 weeks ago in the case of the Irish. We also saw it last week in the case of indigenous people and African Americans and so on. Concerns that this kind of ethnically complex, religiously complex, plural society was not a stable society, that there's a kind of social destabilization brought on by mass immigration. So the argument becomes one that common schools can become a way of unifying this, of providing uniformity, of disciplining people, as we might say. Disciplining them, don't think in a corporal sense, although that can be part of it, but also of just disciplining them to think and function and act in particular fashions. In other words, to kind of instill a kind of common sense and a set of accepted norms for the society. So this is going to provide a kind of social stability in societies. This was thought to be very, very important at a time when there's a lot of social upheaval in general because of industrialization and all kinds of social change, but also particularly in a place like Canada, which is being inundated with immigrants who are coming from different countries and bringing different cultures and different ideas to the table. So you need to find ways to bring a uniformity to that, and schools are certainly critical there. Certainly the schools in general are designed, I guess would be the best word, to foster discipline, to foster uniformity and standardization. And you can see this kind of lovely, this is a photograph from the 1870s of a classroom in Upper Canada. And you can see that kind of sense of ordering and regulating children, teaching them to behave, teaching them to perform, teaching them to obey orders. And of course, families do that too, but this is to be done in a kind of mass kind of fashion, to be done by the state with a kind of, again, to go back to those earlier examples of a common set of ideals, a common set of goals for what the students would achieve, and therefore fitting into a kind of national, economic, political, and social kind of framework. You certainly see segregations in schools as well, and kind of again disciplining the society to think of itself this fashion. So you certainly see schools divided, segregated by gender and by age. So you have different grades. You also have male and female dimensions to school. In this example, the previous example, you can see there are boys and girls together in this classroom. But as they got older, they would move them into separate rooms, and the boys and the girls would get different types of education. They would be taught different things, and you'll not be surprised to know that females learned more domestic matters, and boys learned more industrial matters. There's different emphasis on, even in terms of the kind of literatures they would read. Boys would read kind of adventure literature, girls would read romantic literature. Again, that fairly stereotypical stuff, but of course also reinforcing social norms in the middle of the 19th century. But again, at this time of instability, when people are concerned that norms are eroding, so schools become important ways to emphasize and to strengthen those social norms. Now let's get segregated by race. You don't see this much in Upper Canada, where you have specific schools designated for African Americans. You do in Nova Scotia have a couple of schools designated as schools, as this one's called, for colored children. Very, very, very 19th century expression. And there are schools that are effectively segregated in Upper Canada, where black communities tend to send most of their kids to one school, but it's not an official designation. It's just a kind of the way the communities are organized. Of course, communities don't just organize naturally on their own. There's lots of stories there as well. But in the sense that this was an institution created specifically for African Americans in Nova Scotia, and that was not a good school. And in fact, for those of you who know stories of residential schools, the stories that are told about the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children sound an awful lot like the kind of stories you would hear about residential schools, about abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse, all kinds of really deeply troubling stories coming out of those stories. Speaking of residential schools, modern schools are also segregated by race but for Indigenous people. And certainly this is a much larger project than those for African American kids. This is all across Canada. This is for all Indigenous people. These schools would last into the 1970s. So would be running for over 100 years, but more or less have their start in the 1840s. And they will be a way of attempting to assimilate Indigenous people, in many ways to punish them into becoming effectively white British citizens. And a history of a legacy, a profound legacy of barbaric treatment of Indigenous people in these schools. But again, a kind of clear sense that mass education, so in some ways this is very much like what's going on in the regular common school system, but also in a way that's really quite different, because you're selecting these kids because of their race, and you're not providing them with a standard education. You're providing them with an education that's designed to change them. So if there's a kind of certain kind of assumption of providing uniform education for ordinary white settler families, you could say that it's the same for these people. I guess you could say that the end is the same. But there's a clear sense here that these are people who are quite different and who must be changed, whose cultures must be destroyed so that they can become like us, so they can become like the white civilization that is now dominating them. And so that resulted in what can only be described as kind of barbaric attacks on people, physical abuse, but also kind of cultural abuse of constant denigration of those people's societies and cultures. But there's a whole range of social institutions rather, that we can look at. And the biggest ones in terms of funding are schools, but also penitentiaries, prisons, and asylums that are being built throughout this time period. So we have major penitentiaries built all across British North America, in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, in Lower Canada, Upper Canada, 3 or 4 built in Upper Canada. Major asylums built, again, gradually across the country in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. But by the 1860s, every colony has a significant mental health asylum of some sort, and often on this kind of scale. Now, this is probably the biggest one in British North America, the Toronto Asylum. These buildings, some of these buildings anyhow, still exist in Toronto. And they're massive institutions. Very expensive to build, very expensive to maintain, and they're bringing mentally ill people. What that means in the 19th century is something worth exploring in and of itself, but bringing people who lack basic mental health stabilities into these institutions, ideally to be cured, but as we'll see, and one of your readings is very good on this, that the cure wasn't always as clear, and the technique for the cure wasn't quite as clear as they might have hoped. And in many ways, it's kind of an experiment underway here. Here's the Toronto Asylum again in 1841. This is the new central prison built in Toronto in 1871. Again, what I want you to see here is both size. These are enormous buildings, but also a kind of similar architecture as well. They're understood to perform similar functions. And much of this function is coming. This is again a picture of the Toronto Asylum again from the 1840s, and it's showing. This is a lovely illustration of this. It's showing the light of science shining down on these institutions. And there's a real sense here, a real hope, something optimistic here, that they can reform the individual, that they can bring the mentally unstable person back to good, effective, functioning citizenship in our society. And of course, if you think about it, that's what a prison is supposed to do too. A prison is supposed to reform a criminal, to turn them into a good citizen. And of course, what a school is supposed to do is not a bad person or a misformed person, but an immature person, and to form them into an adult who will function in the society as well. So again, we see at the broadest level a kind of comparable set of purposes here. So state institutions designed in many ways to create the modern British North American citizen in this new democratic society. So a kind of enforcement of norms. And I don't want to imply anything too coercive here. Well, in prisons, I guess that's pretty fair to be coercive. But I'm not trying to say they're all like prisons. But there is a kind of common sense that we can act on individuals, that we can train individuals to perform and act in ways that are appropriate in a modern, liberal, democratic society. So there's a lot of optimism here, but also, as you can see and can imagine, a surprising level of coercion in this as well. We are, of course, supposed to be free individuals in a liberal society. And in many ways, this is kind of sometimes literally beating that freedom into us. Probably the wrong way to say it, but beating a disciplinary capacity into people that allows them to act in a free society. Maybe that's a kinder way to put that. This is a beautiful example of this. This is the so-called panopticon designed by Jeremy Bentham, a 19th century British philosopher. And the whole idea of the panopticon, you can see it in the lower half of the diagram here, this circular part of the diagram. Those are prison cells, and they all face towards the center. And the idea with the panopticon is that the prisoner would always, not necessarily be observed, but the prisoner could always be observed. And you might think, well, that's good. That means that the guard could always watch the prisoners. That wasn't necessarily the ideal. It's part of it. So the guard could see the prisoners. But it was also so that that the prisoner would know that he is always capable of being watched. He cannot assume he is beyond the surveillance of the prison official. In other words, he may always be being watched. So we talk about this today in our societies with video surveillance and so on. There's always a camera somewhere watching us. And that's a concern for privacy, to be sure. But this is a deliberate attempt to remove people's privacy and to say, we are watching you. We are going to compel you to behave well. And this is, again, a way of reforming individuals again. Now, so that was the ideal. That was the panopticon model. But here's Kingston Penitentiary from a photograph from about 1880. And you can see it works in exactly that fashion, the circular organization of the cells and the central form of surveillance from the center. Schools, too, we already saw this picture, but schools, too, have that kind of architecture, that kind of behavioral, enforced disciplinary action where people are compelled to perform by what somebody else is saying them, to obey somebody else's commands. And schools are very much set up in that same kind of fashion, that people will be watched, observed, surveilled, and therefore disciplined into correct behavior. Prisons did the exact same thing, trying to foster discipline through a kind of uniformity and standardization of practices. This is going on. This is not just British North America. This is happening in Britain. In fact, most of these ideas are being learned in Great Britain, but of course also the United States, another major influence on Canada at the time. This is an industrial facility from Kingston Penitentiary. So then also the buildings themselves were designed to create uniformity and standardization. And what we see is a kind of common design of hospitals and mental institutions, particularly in this time period, which are designed both to be efficient in terms of organization. So you can see this kind of linear organization with rooms going off to the sides, but that also provide variety, provide ability to shut down corners and sections of the buildings, allows lots of light to come in because you've got lots of windows, lots of exposed spaces. Allows a kind of sense of possibility of natural healing for the people inside. And this kind of basic design. So here's one that's called the Kirkbride Plan. Here's the one on the top is from London, Ontario. The one on the bottom is from Halifax, Nova Scotia. They're working under the same basic plans. And if you look at institutions in New Jersey and New York and Great Britain, following that same basic plan. So there's a kind of architecture here, kind of thought that's guiding the construction of this entire process. That's in asylums, but we also see them in prisons, and there's that Kingston Penitentiary with that. Notice the radiating center that you can watch everybody from the inside. We see it in schools, we see it in the organization and disciplining of students in those schools, and we see it in hospitals and prisons as well. So these are common features across these institutions. So there's not only a kind of state connectedness here in the sense that the state is building them and paying for them and taxes are paying for them, but there's also a sense here of a common method of reforming individuals to bring them back into the liberal democratic society, to reform these people. We speak of reform, but it's, think of it as the creation of that word, to reform these people. Probably a better way to think about this. So some quick conclusions. These are institutions for democratic societies. They're meant to provide services to as many people, but also to bring people into that society, to help them integrate that into society. So you both want mass outreach to make it available to people, but also to serve the society as much as possible. you can see a kind of rational scientific architecture behind all of this that really establishes a kind of form, a kind of common set of ideals behind these buildings and these institutions. And we can also see that they're state funded. And that's going to become increasingly important in the 19th century. And as we get to Confederation next week, you'll see that it's also important for just thinking about Confederation. One of the things that becomes apparent in the 1860s is that as these institutions grow, as schools grow, and prisons and asylums and all the rest of it, plus other things like railway construction, states are being called upon to spend more and more and more money. And that means raising more and more taxes. So how can they do that? So they're looking for ways to alter the structure of government, to find new sources of taxation. So industrialization becomes an attractive end, not just because it provides jobs, not just because it's progressive, but because it provides additional sources for taxation. So they're looking for ways to grow economies, looking for ways to build the state, but also looking for ways to raise the money to build those states. So this is a kind of package that we're seeing here, an expanding state, a developing state, and one which is designed both to serve, but in many ways actually to create the liberal democratic societies that we're seeing emerging at this time. When we think about liberal democracy, we think first and foremost, as we should, about elected assemblies and the freedom that one has in a democratic society. But there's also institutions there to protect and maintain and manage, and as these readings suggest, to discipline the people within that society. When you offer people freedom, you need to also find ways to impose restraints on them. And certainly these institutions are designed to find that balance between freedom, between liberty, and restraint. And that's really part of a concern in 19th century society. How do we find that balance, and how do we find the institutions to help us maintain that balance?